Good afternoon, everybody. It's Bob Jones here, a member of CACOR, and it's been my privilege to introduce our speaker today. Uh, my readings show that this is meeting number 299 in a series of presentations by CACOR, and it's curious because both Geoff and I had minor personal issues going on, and had we known that in advance, we might have been able to push this forward. And Geoff, you could have claimed number 300 to check off as the presentation. But happily, these have all worked out and we're ready to go right now. Geoff has spoken 4 times that I know of to CACOR already, so he's not only a well-known person with the group, but he's also a member of the board of directors. He and I started weather forecasting way back in the 60s at the same station, Shearwater, and our paths divided at that point, and Geoff got interested in atmospheric science and got his master's and PhD. And beyond that, he's done very, very well in CMOS, Canadian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society, for which I am the liaison person with CACOR, and he has tons of awards. He's been involved in weather and environmental issues for over 60 years. He's, as I said, a climate scientist, atmospheric by profession, earning his PhD in '85. His thesis then was on multi-scale thunderstorm dynamics at U of A, Alberta, University of Alberta. He's a 50-year member of CMOS, and he's a fellow of the Society. He's won numerous prizes. If you go to the CMOS website and click on awards and put Geoff's name in, you'll get 15 hits. So he's done it all with CMOS, fellow, graduate student, past president, and so on. And as I mentioned, he's a director of CACOR. Today, though, he's going to talk to us about the biblical texts and help us improve thinking on environmental processes and the climate crisis. I think this is a brand new subject. I'm looking forward to it very much. He's going to analyze ancient narratives through the modern scientific lens, identifying parallels with scriptural accounts and current science. This includes the Genesis creation story, evolution, the Noah's Ark and the flood, the scientific statements about continental drift, and hydrometeorology. The Bible is not simply a mix of mythology and religious psychology. It actually contains a lot of significant scientific statements and facts. The unanswered question here then, says Geoff, what is the source of these statements, and have they virtually any way that we can connect them or access them to mathematics and science? So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Geoff, and please go ahead, Geoff.
Yeah, well, given the title of this talk, Science in Scripture, and today's climate crisis, some might wonder, why would I mix a presentation on climate change with Scripture? Good question, and I don't have a complete answer, but the whole concept came to mind about a quarter century ago when I was teaching physical geography at King's University in Edmonton, from 2002 to 2012 when we moved out here to the coast. Physical geography includes all of those natural sciences: meteorology, oceanography, climatology, ecology, and some of the inanimate sciences of geology, geophysics, and so on. King's University is a Christian college supported by the Dutch Reformed Church. And as I had an 8 a.m. class, when one would normally start the day with prayer, I chose to start each class with a single passage of scripture that was related to my topic in physical geography for that day, and involved a brief discussion of it with the students. Initially, I thought this would not last. I wouldn't find a passage related to every topic, but I did. And for 10 years, I found other references to science in that venerable old book, the Bible, arguably the oldest book in the world. I came to realize that these science statements are an important part of theology that rarely saw the light of day with either theologians or clergy. And that led me to some interesting interpretations of Scripture and a simple additional guideline for Scripture interpretation, which is simply to have an understanding of the amount of information on history, mathematics, and science available to the writers of that period. I was amazed, not at the number of passages I found related to the class material so much, but at the realization that those ancient writers had neither the data nor the understanding of mathematics, science, or even history to make many of the statements that they came up with, especially many in the Old Testament. So I'll be showing you some of those passages with background today, and I give you my personal guarantee that you won't be harmed by a little scripture, especially those passages. In my new book, by the same title as this talk, there are some 190 passages of scripture that are covered, but you will only see a select few of these today. That now takes me back to this photograph on my first slide, which is very important to me in terms of this talk and the book, which basically has only four things in it: the sky, the sea, the horizon separating the two, and some clouds. The horizon, as you probably know, is a mere 5 kilometers from a person's eye level at the shoreline. And this photo provides some very important information on the ancients' way of thinking, which is why I show this question at the bottom. Here it goes. What did the ancients infer from a scene like this? And that question is very important, but we're going to come back to it. When I started to prepare this talk a week ago, I quickly realized I could not possibly touch on all the topics that are in my latest book, a book with the same title as here and 337 pages long. So I'm picking just a few interesting parts from the book. I could have easily written 1,000 pages, but I wouldn't be able to afford the printing costs. So first off, here's a brief outline of the chapter titles in the book. And Clint Eastwood appears here, of course, because of his iconic movie, because I borrowed his movie's title to emphasize how the environment has progressed in terms of the good, and then the bad, human impacts on Earth, the ugly, global climate change instability, and then the real ugly, the climate change impacts. And today I'm really only going to touch on those things that are in purple here. One of the most important concepts in this book concerns interconnections, and you see that I've included 2 chapters on that here, chapters 4 and 5, for I feel that interconnections and the lack of understanding them are at the root of intransigence by governments, by industry, by the media, and by the majority of the public in addressing climate change and its impacts. And for that reason alone, I'll spend a large part of my time on chapter 1 of my book there, you see at the top, as it contains important background science that I feel is essential to understanding climate change and its impacts, and the ultimate threat of a global apocalypse that could follow. Something everyone should realize is that governments and policies come and go. The economy comes and goes. Wars come and go. But anthropogenic climate change does not. The climate is now ever changing, ever getting more threatening, and now there's no going back, I'm afraid. To put aside concerns of the climate crisis while we attempt to solve the economy, wars, homelessness, and other social ills, for example, is sheer folly, if not downright immoral on the part of the government. That's an overall concern of mine, if only because I have 4 great-grandchildren so far, and I seriously wonder what kind of life they may have when they reach 30 years old in the 2050s. You can decide for yourselves if you feel my concerns are justified. And you'll notice it looks rather odd, because it's important to understand certain beliefs of the ancients, and one of these is the belief that the earth was flat. And if you went too far out to sea, you float over the edge of it and you'd disappear forever. You also need to understand that their view of the earth was quite limited to this ellipse I'm showing here, approximately the Mediterranean region and as far east, I suppose, as the Tigris River area, for example. Something like I'm showing here. That's another factor that needs to be considered when interpreting scripture, at least from the Old Testament. They knew nothing about this world out around here. And this latter fact of the flat earth thing is very evident in early maps, which is why cartography is important in scripture interpretation too. But good luck trying to tell that to a theologian. Aristotle proved around 350 BCE that the Earth was a sphere, using geometry and positions of the stars and known planets. However, the sphere idea may have been dropped in favor of a flat Earth again by the Romans, who took over from the Greek Empire when the Greek Empire failed with the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC. So the flat Earth belief by biblical writers is confirmed somewhat by the fact that the trade routes of the Phoenician mariners hugged the coastlines. You'll notice how strange the map looks because that's the trade routes. And they rarely went beyond 5 kilometers offshore, that being the distance of the horizon from the shoreline. The flat Earth is also corroborated by the map of the known world by the well-known Greek cartographer Hecataeus in 500 BC. And this map on the left shows a simple continent surrounded by Oceanus. Hecataeus is still referred today as the father of cartography. And note how accurate the map is around the Mediterranean area. You can almost take that area and superimpose on any map today, and it'll link pretty well. But note how I compare that with the Roman map on the right-hand side. That's the map by the first Roman geographer Pomponius Mela in 45 CE. So over 500 years after this one, and notice the inaccuracies that have come back here. But again, it's one continent surrounded by Oceanus or whatever they called it. And then it's in Latin, so I can't read it all. While the Romans were well known for their engineering and architectural feats, they exhibited little interest in science, in part due to the lack of a digital number system that included the concepts of zero and negative numbers. Those concepts came in later and very important in the development of math and science. Just imagine simply adding up a column of Roman numerals, and you'll get the idea of what I mean here. One of the most important conceptual models of the natural sciences is the hydrometeorological cycle, a theory presented first, or so we thought, by Bernard Palissy in 1580. And it's a theory that basically says that the water balance of major river basins remain constant, while that of the whole Earth is a closed system and also constant. The water budget then is basically this precipitation minus the evapotranspiration equals the runoff, R, plus some error term, where evapotranspiration is a combination of open water evaporation, transpiration, and sublimation. I mentioned the latter because during the program of MAGS, Mackenzie-Geoff study, our hydrologists discovered that about of the snowpack through the winter, about 30% of it disappears through sublimation, directly from the solid to the vapor stage. However, Palissy's theory could not be tested without both stream flow data to measure surface water flow and upper radiosonde data to measure water vapor flow, instruments for which were not developed until the 1930s. So the GWEX, the Global Energy and Water Exchanges Program, was organized through the World Meteorological Organization in the 1990s, and the Canadian component of this was MAGS. And the reason we chose the Mackenzie River Basin because it's a northward flowing river to contrast with the American project in GWEX, which was on the Mississippi and the southward flowing, but comparable areas of the drainage basins there. I was invited to participate as the secretariat for MAGS and to monitor the moisture budgets, which I had a lot of experience with working in Alberta. I partnered with a hydrological modeler, Rick Soulis, from the University of Waterloo. He's now passed on. And we were able to balance the total water budget of the Mackenzie River Basin, employing radiosondes, stream flow measures that they had out, and both meteorological and hydrological mathematical models. Our partnership was a huge success, as our results helped corroborate Palissy's theory that the water balance of a major river basin and over all of Earth is constant. And we published this in the atmospheric, the CMOS journal, Atmosphere Ocean, in 2002. But later, a short while later, I started teaching at King's. And lo and behold, while searching out some passages and working on the hydrometeorological cycle, I came across this piece of scripture from Ecclesiastes, which was written by King Solomon about 950 BC, that all rivers run into the sea, but yet the sea is not full. From where the rivers come, there they return again, and the cycle continues. I should have looked a little bit further on, a few verses where he wrote, "Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new. It has already been in the ages before us. The people of long ago are not remembered, nor will there be any remembrance of people yet to come by those who come after them." So Palissy and ourselves didn't pay attention to King Solomon's statement there, because that's a very succinct statement of the hydrologic cycle. Okay, so realizing that these people believed in a flat earth where water ran off the edges, the sky was another water body, and they had no understanding of evaporation and condensation. So the question is, how could Solomon write this statement of science? He couldn't, based on his own knowledge, for the science facts did not exist then and would not for another 2,500 years. So this led me into looking for other statements, and later on I had all these passages of scripture that were related to science, and it led me to develop a Bible study, Questions of Environmental Stewardship Theology, or QUEST, for which my book provides the details. And I led that at 3 or 4 Anglican and United churches, and had lots of participants. Okay, so back to Aristotle. About 350 BCE, then, Aristotle used geometry and positions of stars and planets to prove that the Earth was a sphere. The Greek Empire virtually disintegrated with the death of Alexander the Great. His death left no clear successor, triggering off wars among his generals, and gradually the Roman Empire came into prominence. But another Greek scientist later, about 200 BCE, and I can't pronounce his name, Eratosthenes or something or other, he calculated the circumference of Earth and its actual tilt with remarkable accuracy. And he was the one that suggested that the Earth was the center of the universe, and all the planets and the sun and the stars revolved about it. And the importance of that is that the early church adopted this geocentric theory, as they call it. And that led to problems later, because the church initially, during the 1600s and even into the 1700s, they funded most scientific research, and they didn't like what the scientist was doing. He had to stop it. So that held back people like Copernicus and Newton and others to some extent. Okay, we're back to this picture here, and I've already said something about it that I wish I hadn't said earlier. But anyway, as we said, there's the water body here, the sky, the clouds, and of course this mysterious line out here, which we know as the horizon. So my question was, what did the ancients infer from a scene like this? Well, first of all, the ancients believed the Earth was flat, and they had no information whatsoever about the makeup of the atmosphere. It was just up there somewhere. The sea was a body of water. It appeared blue, yet if you look straight down from a boat, it appears transparent. Likewise, the sky, which would have been a deeper blue than we see today with much less air pollution, was also blue. And yet at nighttime, when you look straight up, it was transparent, allowing them to see the stars and moon. So it was obvious to them that the sky was also a body of water. The fact that when it rained, the water came from the sky just simply cemented that view. So we're going to start now with the first book of the Bible, Genesis 1, which is discussed in detail in my book, and I'm only going to cover a little bit here. In particular, three critical passages. Here's two of them here, and I used the King James version of it. Okay, that's important as well in this context. And verse 6 says, God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Now, if you read that without knowing what the ancients were looking at here, you would say, well, what kind of gobbledygook is that? How do you divide waters from the waters? And then verse 7 says, God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament, the sea, from the waters which were above the firmament, the sky, and it was so. Now, those two passages now make perfectly good sense, given the little information they had. But verse 8 is an interesting, there's the firmament. Verse 8 is an interesting thing because it says, and God called the firmament heaven. In other words, he's saying, this is heaven. Well, this is what the person who wrote this wrote. And later revisions of the Bible, and they always worked from the King James Version. After the King James Version, they changed the word firmament to dome because they didn't figure out that what he was talking about here. So they called it the dome. So then everyone after that assumed that, well, heaven is up there in the sky somewhere, right? And that's not what the original version was saying, which was written after they looked at the King James Version. They looked through all of the ancient documents and everything to come up with that. There's an interesting twist to this in a wood carving that appeared in a book in 1888 by this chap Flammarion, where the man declared that he had found the separation where heaven and earth meet. Now, by the 1800s, of course, they knew that the earth was a sphere, so the horizon became a curve, like as it is, of course, in reality. But how he came across that, I don't know, but it's a bit dramatic, perhaps. But however, theoretical physicists today have mentioned the possible existence of other spatial dimensions beyond the three that we can observe, an area of research called string theory. And I'll leave you with all that to ponder. I'm not going to say any more about that. We'll move on to this one. This is another piece of scripture in Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 4. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and let the rough ground become a plain, and the rugged terrain a broad valley. Later, in chapter 54, he wrote something similar, for the mountains shall depart and the hills be removed. Now, virtually all theologians and clergy interpret these statements as in this statement from the New Testament Gospel of Luke. He has brought down the powerful from their seats and exalted them of low degree. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. That's a perfectly valid and reasonable analogy to make to these passages. But these are also scientific statements referring to the rock cycle of a part of continental drift. The problem with this scientific statement by Isaiah is that he had no information of tectonic processes of that kind, nor could he or anyone else have ever observed the cycle during his lifetime. There's a huge difference in elevation between these two. This is Mount Everest, of course, and this is Mount Washington in New Hampshire. And a big difference in the elevation. But Mount Washington is 10 times older than Mount Everest. Mount Everest is a baby mountain in terms of the geological timeline. And geophysicists have determined from the stuff that's left on either side of the mountain that initially they estimated that Mount Washington was probably as high as 10,000 meters, higher than Everest at some time in the past. And so if Isaiah had gone to this scene here, which he couldn't, but if he had when he was a teenager, say at 15, and then returned 50 years later, as an old man, because he died in his late 60s, he would not have noticed any difference in the geology, only the ice and snow that he sees. So he had no way of coming up with this statement he made in Isaiah 44, which makes you start to wonder, where did he get his information? So on what basis did he make these statements of science? Let's go on a bit to evolution. Charles Darwin in 1859 wrote his book on the origin of species. This was after some years after his famous trip to the Galapagos. And he came up with this theory of evolution, but he started from the purple print in here, from the plants to the sea creatures, the birds, and so on. And then, but the one of the suggestions he made in here is that humans probably evolved from the apes. Well, that really upset the Roman Catholic and other churches, I suppose, because they believed that God had physically put humans on the earth at some time in the past. And they were ready to excommunicate Darwin, except that numerous other scientists came forward and supported Darwin through fossil records and genetic studies, while much more was added to evolution theory over the next century, including this part up in here. And of course, the Big Bang, it came out in about 1923. And English biologist Thomas Huxley, for example, commented, "How extremely stupid not to have thought of this before," in support of Darwin, of course. The church finally came around, but all they had to do was to read all of chapter 1 of Genesis. Okay, and I'm not going to read it, of course. I'm just listing the chapters here. And each one of these coincides with something across the way here. Same time. But the real mystery is not that he came up with this, but the writer of Genesis 1 has the order correct. Now, Genesis was only put down on paper or parchment back about 500 or 600 BC. Up until that time, I suppose it had been passed along by oral tradition. So they didn't have enough information either to come up with this. So there's the real mystery here, that how did the writer of Genesis manage to get the correct order of evolution? Let's go on. I mentioned that I dedicated chapters 4 and 5 to interconnections. Oh, sorry about that. Including a balance within nature on the surface and interconnections with atmospheric dynamics in the upper atmosphere. And nature often appears to be disordered and random, but as you focus your attention on different scales, you notice patterns, sequences, and symmetry on all sorts of scales. That statement I just made forms a large part of all the research that I've done, is recognizing patterns and sequences and symmetry to come up with results along with your data. When the U.S. Congress sent a delegation out to the Pacific Coast to discuss possible land purchases from the First Nations people, this would be in the early 1850s, Chief Seattle, who was the overall leader of the Duwamish tribes in what today is the state of Washington, tried to explain to the delegation that they could no more sell them the land they stood on than they could sell the air they breathed or the water they drank, and he welcomed them to come and settle among his people. That was likely the impetus for the U.S. and also Canada to make claim over most of the land in North America. And of course, the rest is history. However, Seattle also tried to explain interconnections in nature to these white people. I can't remember the circumstances where this came up, but he said, all things are connected. Like the blood which unites one family, all things are connected. Man did not weave the web of life. He's merely a strand in it. And whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. Now, when he said connected, he didn't mean like touching as the figure of the hands on the left-hand side. He meant interlocking hands, like on the right-hand side. So that if you remove, damage, or destroyed any one part of that system, it affects all other parts. Once again, the white people did not pay attention, and they still don't. We're now going to jump all the way over to chapter 6, the bad, human impacts on the environment, and not necessarily climate-related things. So I'll go through this fairly quickly. One of the biggest cases of destruction of the environment by humans is in the Aral Sea, and it involved irrigation carried out by the Soviet government. They just, in trying to improve, I suppose, crops and bring water to people, they destroyed a valuable fisheries program that went on in here, transportation, and a water source. It also resulted in a much drier climate because this turned into desert here. So you can see there were many seagoing ships that were left stranded on now the desert, which is a tourist attraction these days, I suppose. And for many hundreds of miles and kilometers around, then this became a much drier climate. I'll mention clear cutting of forests, and the example I show is in the foothills because there I have some experience with that because a lot of my research was in this area from here northward into Limestone Mountain, that's just up in here. My research on thunderstorms. And over the years from 1985 to 2015, this is what's happened there. This is a ridge here. And of course, on slopes where it was not replanted, successive spring snowmelt and summer rains because precipitation is highest in the summertime in Alberta. These got washed out and they probably won't be returned. So they've made a real mess of it. And the reason is because Alberta government gave them basically a free hand in the forests while their focus was on fossil fuels and still is today, of course. So forests out of sight from the public were never replanted and nature and erosion took its course. One more here, oil tanker spills. Now, I could have talked about the Exxon Valdez disaster on Alaska's coast in 1989 or the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. But instead, I chose a smaller Canadian oil spill that occurred on Chedabucto Bay in Nova Scotia here back in 1970, partly because I was part of the oil spill cleanup team as the on-site weather forecaster, so I have some personal relation to this. Here's the tanker here before it broke apart completely and sank, but you can see it's already split in two, and it was leaking oil all around. And they use these booms to try and contain the oil. The problem is you're dealing with dilbit, which is diluted bitumen. That's the stuff that comes out of the oil sands, for example. The dilbit, it evaporates very quickly, and then the rest of it sinks to the bottom. And anyone familiar with oil spill cleanups know that that's virtually impossible to clean it up on the ocean once it does that. Oil spill cleanups on oceans are less than 10% successful. There's lots of experience of that these days on the coast of California, for example. So all of Chedabucto Bay up in here on the upper right was closed to fishing, and it still is today, an ongoing disaster result. One more, tailing ponds leaks into rivers, and of course we're talking about the oil sands now, where they seem to, all of their tailings ponds seem to put them on the side closest to the Athabasca River. Now you can imagine that you would get lots of leaks into the river from that, and they do. But worse than that, here's another picture, a different area here, still in the oil sands here. Here's other tailings ponds here, and you can see the close proximity of the Athabasca River again. And of course, the leaks occur, it's going to all the way downriver, northward. The river goes to Lake Athabasca and on into the Mackenzie system, and that's carried along. And the First Nations people who live along that river and around the lake have had many incidents of cancer at early ages, and they come up with weird looking fish, that have, I saw one photo of a fish with two heads. That's kind of scary. but that's what happened. And here's another picture. A few leaked out of where they have tailing ponds not leaking into the river, but draining out. They put pipes in to drain them, and this goes directly into the Athabasca River. That is more than just disgusting, right? And it also illustrates the dishonesty of the fossil fuel industry. And we have many other incidents to say that as well. Here's an interesting quote from Isaiah in Scripture. The earth lies polluted under its inhabitants, for they have transgressed laws, violated the statutes, and broke the everlasting covenant. And that's what's happening with fossil fuels these days, and many other industries besides. I have a dictum that I just don't trust large corporations at all. I just assume they're going to be dishonest. So we skip now over to chapter 8 and we get to the real ugly. The real ugly are the impacts from climate change. And I'll say right off that climate change impacts are most serious in the subtropics. We'll cover some of that here. But why are climate impacts more important than other human-caused impacts on the environment? Climate change affects everything on Earth. Other disasters don't. Carbon emissions from fossil fuels, this is an important one, are cumulative. So that means that atmospheric carbon dioxide, for example, has a half-life of 30 years. That is when 50% of it remains. But almost 40% remains after a century and remains above 30% for many centuries after that. Unlike other pollutants like, say, sulfur dioxide, which gets rained out of the atmosphere within weeks, right? So it just doesn't go away. This means that even if all carbon emissions were terminated today, the climate would continue to warm for many decades, maybe centuries. Politicians, unfortunately, do not understand this at all, and that shows in their policies. And they're fed disinformation by the fossil fuel industry. And of course, they do not pay attention to the science. So the heat energy that we add to the atmosphere through burning fossil fuels goes into energizing all dynamic systems in the atmosphere and ocean because we're putting energy into the system, not just increasing the surface temperatures. And that's another example of misunderstood interconnections. One such dynamic system is the Hadley circulation. Now, we normally think of the Hadley circulation as being confined between the equator and the subtropics. So generally speaking, it goes from 30 degrees north to 30 degrees south on average, right? And of course, because of the convergence of heat and moisture at the equator, you get these storms that go up very rapidly. Within 30 minutes, you've got heavy precipitation coming out of a thunderstorm, but the air keeps going up. Now it's dry, and it continues right up to the tropopause. And dry air, of course, cools more rapidly than moist air. So it arrives at the tropopause very cold, and then it starts its subsidence on both sides of the equator, comes downward, and then this dry air heats up rapidly at about 1 degree Celsius per every 100 kilometers. And that's what causes the major Earth's deserts in the subtropics. The Sahara, the Arabian, all of the great deserts of the world are around that latitude or a little bit more in Asia because they're higher on the latitudinal thing. But I said that these systems are dynamically increased by our warming of the atmosphere, putting energy into it. And so here's a thing that this diagram they missed out on, that some of that subsiding air doesn't all return to the equator. Some of it is going northward, joins the Ferrel cell, and brings with it drier air. And that's resulted in more frequent droughts and, of course, wildfires in the mid latitudes. Okay, I think we can leave that. I want to go to chapter 10, climate change in Scripture, where the worst impacts are in the subtropics. It results in desertification because of the Hadley system. drought, water shortages, failed crops, famines, deaths, and of course, climate refugees. And the pictures tell the story themselves. I don't need to go through those. But also this other extension of it northward into the mid latitudes. So this is a Kamloops, BC wildfire in 2020. And I can just imagine these were homes on the other side of the lake here, what do they call the Shuswaps? No, this is Kamloops. Sorry about that. But and they were evacuated from their homes here. You can see the lights on here, and a lot of them would be over on the other side in the town of Kamloops, looking over there and watching these fires creeping down and suddenly enveloping their own home. You can imagine how those people must have felt. And here's another picture from Australia, obviously, because of the kangaroo in it, of the terrible wildfires they had in 2020 as well. And we're seeing the same thing happening this year already in BC. We've had some major fires, and it's only mid or late June now. Here's another one, climate change in scripture. Well, wait a minute. The picture here is from 2021 in Ethiopia, where they were having a major drought. And this would normally be filled with water. It's what they call a water pan. And locals would collect their water here. But of course, it's dried up here. And you see all these people out here digging holes all over, trying to find some water. And notice that these people are almost I think entirely women, because they do all the work I found out in Africa. Most of the work is done by women. And here's an example from Jeremiah, who lived about 600 BC, who wrote, "Her nobles send their servants for water. They come to the cisterns. They find no water. They return with their vessels empty. They're ashamed and dismayed and cover their heads because the ground is cracked, because there's been no rain on the land. And the farmers are dismayed and they cover their heads. They're embarrassed." I found this out working for volunteering for the Anglican Church in their international outreach, mostly to Africa. And I spent a week or so, a couple of weeks in Tanzania, in the south of Tanzania, where they were having some drought, not as severe as this. But I found that people were reluctant to talk about it. They were actually embarrassed about it, as if it was their fault, when really it's our fault in the mid latitudes. We're the ones that have caused the climate warming. I saved this one for the last here for climate change in Scripture. It's the Noah flood story, and it's given in Genesis chapter 6 to 9. And I saved it because it has quite a number of impossible, invalid details. The meteorology is all wrong. There's no way that there's not enough water on the earth or in the earth to have covered the earth completely with water. But you have to remember what was their world. What they knew as the world was roughly this area here, which included what we call the Bible lands, or whatever you call it, down in here, Iraq, Iran, Turkey. And here's Mount Ararat at over 5,100 meters, where supposedly, according to the Bible, the Noah's Ark came to rest on the side of that. And people have gone out there with many expeditions, mostly church people, to try and find the remains of the ark. They'll never find it because there never was an ark. Because that's the other thing. Here's an artist's imaging of the Noah's Ark based on the dimensions given in the Bible. And it's roughly almost half the size of the Titanic. Now, the Titanic took 2 or 3 years to build in Belfast, Ireland, and it had 3,000 people working on it. And they had modern tools, at least modern for the 1910 period. And you can imagine the kind of tools they would have had here. And Noah couldn't have just phoned up his local Home Depot and ordered a load of lumber or anything. They had to find the trees first, and then had to go cut the trees, and they had to, shape the lumber and everything with very, very crude tools. So there's no way that the ark was ever built. Not in the time we're talking about. And there was only Noah plus his 3 sons. However, remember that there are a number of other records of a great flood in that area. There was the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I have a copy of that book on the Euphrates River, and another Epic of Atrahasis, they call it, on the Tigris River. Here's the Euphrates River here, and it joins up with the Tigris River coming down from here. So my take on it is that this part of eastern Turkey, which is mostly above 2,000 meters, was glaciated around the same time as the Laurentide glaciation in North America. And because it was so high, it would have taken longer for it to deglaciate and stretch it into the time period of what is supposed to be Noah's time. I've tried to figure out when he existed, and my guess is about 2100 or 2200 BC. And I think somewhere around Mosul, because it's the only town in Iraq that was still there 4,000 years ago. And also because the only forest where he could have gotten trees was up in here. And so that's where they would have had to get their trees. But I don't think they ever did. I think when it deglaciated, there was a great flood in that area sometime around 2000 or 2100 BC. And you can imagine that if it formed melt ponds like glaciers do when they melt. This is one on the Greenland ice sheet today, but it would have been a large one, probably center over this lake here. And when it melted, there would have been a huge flood. And think of the quantity of energy coming from 2,000 meters down to Old Mosul is at about 200 meters above sea level. The force of that coming down in these two rivers, because it would have drained towards the southwest into these two rivers probably, or maybe it created these rivers, and it would have wiped out virtually every living creature in that area, which is probably what happened. But I suspect Noah and his family, if they existed, and we don't know that for sure, probably survived on some tree or other for a couple of days as it floated out towards the Gulf. That's my take on it, and so likely there was a major flood event, and they probably survived by clinging to some large tree, all of which you can read in my explanation in the book. Chapter 11 is about our call to environmental stewardship, but within it, I talk about what is Canada doing about the climate crisis, because this concerns us, right? And the graphic on the left here is from 2019, but it was the most recent one I could find. You'll notice that the major sources of greenhouse gases are from oil and gas, 26%, and transportation, 25%. And of that 25%, about 20% would be private vehicles. If all those vehicles were EVs, fully electric, of course, there's 20% saving in emissions right there, approximately, right? And if we went to renewable energy, then if we did it in a big way, then you would reduce the demand for oil and gas, and you would remove a large part of this. At the same time, a lot of these which are running on fossil fuels would also be reduced. So what is Canada doing? Well, here are their carbon emissions from 1990 to 2023. The data was on the Environment Climate Change Canada website. I just took it off and plotted it in Excel, and here's what you get. But around about 2021, they started giving reports, press releases actually, and the first one in 21 said, since 2005, which was their baseline year, we have reduced emissions 9% down to here in 2020. And that's mostly due to our carbon pricing program. They didn't mention the fact that in 2020 was the big COVID year when a lot of industries shut down all over the globe for anywhere from 1 to 4 or 5 months. And of course, that's why emissions reduced, and every country saw that reduction in emissions. And you can guess that the following year they would increase, and certainly they did in 2021 and 2022. So then what the government said, well, we got to show some reduction here, not increases. So they said from 2018 to 2021, we reduced emissions 6%. They're not exactly lying, but it's not truthful, is it, to do that? And I did publish a few things on that, pointing it out. But then we go to 2023 emissions, and in 2024, when they had totaled up the emissions, what they did, they went in and reduced all of the previous data by anywhere from 20 to 30 megatons. Now, they use a flimsy excuse having to do with a different way they were computing emissions from methane. I don't buy it one bit here. And so now they're able to say we have a 9% reduction in emissions from 2005 to 2024. Notice the last 3 years, they actually reduced the emissions. So how did they explain that? I did write to ECCC and ask for an explanation. That was months ago, and I haven't heard from them since. But anyway, so emissions were not going down. They had to change the database. And I published that in the CMOS Bulletin 2026. Okay. So this whole concept of net emissions is totally unnecessary. Who cares what the emissions were in 2005, whether they were 730 or 749 or 732, I think they were, and now they've become 755. The important thing is, are they reducing them over here? And they could have used the term near emissions, near emissions by 2050. But the fossil fuel industry developed this system of net emissions back in the 90s, and they sold it. Well, they persuaded governments all around the world to adopt it, which most of them did, without really thinking about it, as far as I'm concerned. And a lot of climate scientists have actually believed in the net emissions idea as well. They still publish articles where they use the term net emissions, which I don't agree with. Okay, so why is Prime Minister Carney positive about a new pipeline? Well, if you look at the data, more than 80% of Canada's fossil fuel production is exported. So we're exporting our accountability of carbon emissions to other countries. So we can hardly claim to be, presenting a good mission, good picture of Canada's effort at reducing emissions, because we're not. And the solutions to the climate crisis, I talk about that. We'll just. So is clean renewable energy, and here are the things that it does: ignore fossil fuels, develop renewable energy systems at municipal scales, and use mesogrids at the municipal scale, or microgrids, which I refer to as single-family systems, like ART's system, for example. All of them feeding into the meso system and into the whatever the local regional grid is. I think ARTS goes directly into the local grid, which would be fed into a provincial and national grid, which we haven't really developed yet. And by doing this, you triple your energy security, because you're connected to all of it. So if your system goes down, for example, you can get energy from the other system. But we need to build a Trans-Canada electric grid connecting all communities. We have to include battery storage, which is no longer a problem. Don't let anyone tell you differently. The Chinese are going hell-bent on leather for developing battery storage systems, and they're very successful at it. That allows potential also for any community in Canada to build their own mesogrid, so that they avoid the monopolies of fossil fuels, for example, in Alberta, and the monopoly on nuclear energy in Ontario. And the idea would be then to encourage all small industries and municipalities to go electric at their next maintenance period. and that's easy to sell because it's a lot cheaper to build and to maintain. Okay, so we could skip over this. The, there's a disconnect between IPCC recommendations and member countries. None of us are really reducing emissions as we agreed to at the Paris talks in 2015. And I mentioned Ezekiel here, way back in the Old Testament. He who hears the sound of the trumpet and does not take warning, and a sword comes and takes him away, his blood will be on his own head. So our problems with climate change, they're on the heads of our government as well. The same thing applies. Thomas Edison said way back in 1900, I'd put my money on the sun and solar energy. What a source of power. I hope we don't wait until oil and coal run out before we tackle that. He must be shivering with what's going on there. For the response was that Henry Ford developed his Model T and revolutionized industrial production with his assembly line methods by 1910, which paved the road to perdition as far as I'm concerned. Because at that time, there were actually electric vehicles running, and they could have developed that. Critical environmental processes essential to life. Earth's stratospheric inversion above the tropopause from 12 to 50 kilometers keeps water vapor, clouds stored, microorganisms, etc., all within the troposphere. They don't get outside the troposphere. And were not for that inversion, Earth would have lost all its water due to evaporation to space millions of years ago. The ozone layer, 20 kilometers in the stratosphere, protects life from ultraviolet radiation. And Earth's ionosphere above 50 kilometers protects us from X-rays, cosmic rays, etc. That's why I hate this here talk about people who don't know any better, talking about geoengineering the stratosphere to reduce carbon dioxide effects. I think it's a big mistake unless they do some really good research on it first. Earth's position in the Goldilocks zone is called here. We're on either side of Venus, where the average temperature is plus 450 degrees Celsius, and Mars, where the average temperature is minus 63 degrees Celsius. Mars, incidentally, has a weak tropopause, but is up at 80 kilometers. So needless to say, most of the water on Mars disappeared many millions of years ago. And then there's the other thing that people don't think about is there's a natural balance of atmospheric greenhouse gases that we need left in the atmosphere. And without those, mean global temperature would be around minus 20 degrees Celsius. Earth would be an ice ball. Those issues are covered in my book, not presented in this presentation, and also the threat of an irreversible tipping point in our climate and health impacts of carbon emissions. So I thank you, and we're open to comments or questions. But I'll mention this, that there are some questions that can't be answered by Google or by me, but I'll answer whatever I can. Lastly, I'll mention my book. Because it contains lots of color in there, the printing cost me about $26 each, so I have to try and sell them at $30 plus postage. But later, sometime this summer, we'll have a digital ebook version out, which should be available. The book is 337 pages long. Thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Me, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm Bob back again. I'm going to go through the questions, and we've got quite a few of them, and some of them are very wordy, and as usual, some are comments. So as a moderator of the questions, I'll ask the first one very quickly, and it's an easy answer. And I thought this talk was going to be more focused on the science back in the day in the scriptures, and I know it wasn't mentioned, and there's probably an easy explanation, but Geoff, when the Israelites were heading out to their promised land, the Red Sea was parted, and I just wondered if that's a fairly easy scientific explanation.
I didn't catch the last part of that, Bob. You were talking down, and I.
Sorry. Okay, my question was about the parting of the Red Sea when the Israelites were heading for Egypt. I wondered if there was a an easy scientific explanation for that.
There probably is. Some people have theorized that they crossed in the upper part of it where there's mostly wetland. I don't know, I don't think anyone was there and magically parted the sea. God doesn't interfere in ways like that.
Okay, very good. We'll
Oh,
move
but
on.
I do want to mention what you said about why there isn't more scripture in the presentation. And the reason is because this book is directed at two disparate groups, scientists, for example, who don't want to hear a lot about religion, and of course, to church people who probably don't want to see a lot of technical information. And I'm trying to balance the two of those. That's my only reason for that. There's a lot more. There's about 190 passages of scripture in the book that I discuss in one way or another. Go ahead.
Okay, we have, I'm going to go for the three questioners first, and you partly answered the first question by Ray Lurie, our host. What is the purpose of the book? Go ahead, Ray, with your question. And on deck will be Richard van der Jat.
Hi, Geoff. Yeah, so the question is really about what is the impact you're trying to achieve with the book, right? So are you trying to get people to take action on climate change, or what's really the purpose? Or
That's
is
the
it
main
just
part. Yeah,
that's the
that's
main
the
part?
main part. I'm not trying to entice people into some religious faith or other. That's up to them, right? But it's another way. I mean, I developed that Bible study. My ultimate reason that I didn't tell people was to be able to talk about climate change in the churches, which is not dishonest, but it was, well, but it was also the interest in this scripture that's there. It's amazing some of the things that are there in scripture.
Okay,
Did I
thanks.
answer the question? I'm not sure.
Well, so you know that I do EV advocacy, obviously, right? And I've said many times to people in this group that, from my perspective, it doesn't matter why someone takes a step that's better for the planet. So replacing an ICE vehicle with an EV is better for the planet. It doesn't matter why they do it, as long as they do it, right? So
Yeah,
in that context, it doesn't matter to me how you convince someone to do the right thing, as long as you're able to convince them to do the
yeah,
right thing. Whether I agree with what you're saying or not, it's a different story, right?
yeah.
You know what I
There's
mean?
there's 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 limited ways that we can convince the public or government about this, and I've struggled with that the last 25 years. I've tried everything, giving talks, invited talks free in my local area, and writing editorials, writing even a couple of novels on climate change where the science is true, although it's a fictitious story.
Yeah.
And even this book today.
Mhm. Yeah, so long ago I've realized that people won't buy an EV because it's environmentally friendly. Most people anyways won't do that, right? So what
Yeah,
we do is we focus on what's in it for the person we're talking to, right? And
yeah,
generally speaking, if you explain to them how they could save money, they'll take action, right? So
yeah,
that's usually the thing that works the best for me.
yeah. That's true. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, Richard, you're going to be
Yeah,
coming
thank
up.
you.
Oh, and Dave
Excellent.
Doherty, Dave Doherty's on deck for the
Yes,
third
thank
question.
you. Thank you, Geoff, for a great talk. Um, if you were speaking to Parliament,
Yeah.
how would you speak to them in a way that you could convince them to uh, go for a just transition away from fossil fuels?
In short, I tell them, get off your ass and do something. No. Um, I would just try to explain this business of how carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere, for one, because I think their assumption is that, oh, we can look at this later, and once we reduce carbon emissions, climate warming will stop. Well, it won't because it's cumulative. I don't know what else you can do with them other than to kick them in the ass.
There is a way that you can, and I can tell you about this later on offline, but you can arrange to get to talk to the speaker, or actually email the Speaker of the House, can then invite in people who are parliamentarians to come and listen to you directly, and you might
Yeah,
have some more influence than you think.
About 10 years ago, I did write them about doing exactly that. I never heard back, but I wrote as an email. And as far as I'm concerned, MPs and people in the House do not read emails. They must get thousands of them, right? I mean, I get 100 or more emails every day, and I scan through them, and I bet I don't open 10% of them.
The clerk of the House is a good friend of mine. He lives just around the corner.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that later. I'd like
Yeah.
to maybe look into that.
I think that's the breakfast meeting series. I forget the name of the organization, but yes, that's still going when the House is sitting.
Yeah.
We've spoken to them.
Bacon and egg toast.
Okay, very good, Richard. So we have another question, a brief one from Dave Doherty, and then Meg Sears is on deck for her comment. And after that, we're going to have a fairly good discussion with Andrew Welsh and Michelle Vaughan, who have been waxing back and forth on a lot of stuff here. We'll get to them for sure. Don't forget. So right now it's Dave and then Meg on deck.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Richard did have that correct. It is Bacon and Eggheads, the group
That's
that
the
he
one.
was
Yeah.
referring. I wanted to return to something that you said about the effects of climate change being in the tropics at the moment. While the impacts of climate change may at present be worse in the tropics, have they not started already in the temperate latitudes and the polar regions? Where
Oh, absolutely.
experiencing heat waves and changed
Yeah.
seasonal patterns and unusual storms, and even rising oceans.
Yeah, but
Rain
there's
at the
millions.
North Pole, for example.
But yeah, that's true. But there's millions dying in the subtropics every year. But media and governments up here don't bother to look into that. So we don't hear a lot of it.
Well, those are the poor.
Yeah. They don't have oil and don't have large industry, so they're not important to the mid-latitude industrial world. But yes, we're starting to see a lot of impacts now at mid-latitudes, and so we should. We've caused it.
Yeah, well, I think it's going to get considerably worse too.
Yeah, I think I agree.
Thank you.
Okay, Dave, thanks very much. We have Meg Sears coming up with a question or a comment on Dilbit, and then after that, we're going to move to the first two commentators, which are quite vocal. But we'll get Meg first, and then it'll be Andrew Welsh on deck.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, Geoff. It was just a wonderful talk. I just you mentioned Dilbit sinking, and I just wanted to kind of clarify that Dilbit is a mixture of a diluent and bitumen.
Yeah.
Bitumen is so thick, like you know this, but
Yeah. Diluted bitumen, it stands for.
Pardon?
Dilbit stands for diluted bitumen.
Yes. Some
That's
people
how they
say
move
it's
it through
diluted
pipelines.
bitumen.
Yeah.
But what happens when it goes onto the surface of a lake or something is that the diluent evaporates, and then you've got this thick, more dense stuff that sinks down, and it's absolutely horrible for the lake.
Yeah.
It just kills anything it lands on, and nothing can eat off the bottom, and so on and so forth. But I just added that in the chat. So anyway, it's great to see you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, the Chedabucto Bay oil spill, I remember when I was there, the people that were doing the actual cleanup were really frustrated. They said, we went out to skim this off, but it all disappeared to the bottom. And the beaches today, if you walk along the beaches of Chedabucto Bay, you're liable to, your foot is liable to sink into a mess of oil.
Wow.
Yes, and that's what they're putting into all these pipelines that are going through the mountains and over these, pristine areas and so on and so forth.
That's why
it's Dilbit. So
that's why I'm very much against the new pipeline coming out to the coast here. I mean, the thing is, if we're going to survive, we have to stop using fossil fuels. And that's got to be soon, like in the next decade or two. And by then, those pipelines and that are not going to be worth darn all, right? So.
Yeah, it's a complete waste of money. They're not looking past the end of their nose.
Yeah.
Long-term planning. Anyway, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, up next will be Andrew Welsh, and he had several comments and fairly large biblical reference comments. And so we'll leave it with Andrew. And if he wants to bring Michelle Vaughan into the picture as well, they're both sets of comments
Okay.
have some similarity. But let's start with Andrew. Are you there, Andrew?
Yeah, I made some comments that really speak for themselves, but I think that it's interesting that we have such a narrow vision of what has happened, not just in prehistory, but even in history, and how much knowledge was out there and how much we dismiss. For example, and just in history, I've been reading recently 2 books by Gavin Menzies. One's called 1421 and one's called 1434. And it's basically a book about how China made massive ships, bigger than anything Europe had ever seen, and had sailed around the world long before anybody had thought this might even have been possible, and clearly had circumnavigated the globe. And it's not in any of the history books because we just didn't choose to write about it. And there were other actual suppressions of that history by Chinese emperors for other reasons that I won't get into. But I think that we have to be careful about, how much knowledge was actually present and how much knowledge we have dismissed.
Exactly.
And how much knowledge we continue to dismiss. It's funny, I don't know if it's related or not, but my favorite example is I like to ask people, okay, well, here we are in climate change. How much of the atmosphere do you think is carbon dioxide? And I have, obviously in this crowd, I might get a more accurate answer, but I have yet to encounter anyone, even of average intelligence, who has come up with anything close to what it really is. And they don't talk about that number in the news because it's not a very scary number. They prefer to talk about 350 parts per million or whatever, which is the answer, but nobody is able to translate that into a percent that they think of on a regular basis. It's interesting how we frame knowledge and how we use knowledge in the same way that the government is changing all of its numbers, in the same way that it changes its consumer price index, because it redefines what's in the basket so you can't compare apples and oranges. It happens all the time.
But it's immoral. I say it's immoral. Of
course it's immoral.
Yeah.
Power has nothing to do with morality. It's like,
I agree with you.
You're right. I think the Chinese may have already been to the moon ahead of the Americans.
That's quite possible too. Although we've now looked at the dark side and we didn't see any evidence there either. But
yeah, true.
We didn't look close enough. Yeah. I was just throwing that out there. It's more of a commented discussion piece than a question.
Yeah, well, and again, it comes back to interconnections. They could have paid more attention to Chief Seattle, I think.
Well, I guess one of the things that was kind of a question that I did throw in there is when you talked about the flood, it struck me that the number of cultures completely separated from each other, like indigenous cultures in North America and so on, that all begin with a flood as the origin story, suggests that there's something going on there that is far more expansive than something that happened in Turkey. I don't know.
Yeah, and we've always had floods, but obviously these were major floods where, almost everyone got wiped out. So there has to be something to it. Yeah.
Maybe we're just repeating the cycle now.
Yeah, true.
Well, okay, we're getting pretty close to the end. I see John Hollins has put in a couple of questions and comments. We'll get him right now, but if I could just add one more thing to Andrew's thing, like the business about number of parts per million always has bothered me as well. And the one I'd like to see is how much carbon dioxide does it take, for example, if you're in your house and your generator fails and everybody dies of carbon dioxide? What level is can we not live if too much carbon dioxide is there? And compare that to where we're at Mauna Loa right now.
Yeah. And in fact, the human body cannot detect carbon dioxide. It can only detect the absence of oxygen.
Right. We can still get a percentage. So,
yes, you can. Yeah.
What is the 450? We're at 450 now. Well, where does it get really dangerous for
430.
Life? Pardon?
Yeah. 430 we're at now.
430? Okay. Well,
yeah.
But how high up in parts per million before we need to really, there's a question that should be answered, I think.
It's
Anyway,
probably maximum at the top of the boundary layer,
yeah.
but I'm not sure of that. But
John Hollins, and before I go to John, Michelle Vaughn was also making a comment, but they were related perhaps to Andrew's. Michelle, are you still here? I think she left. She made the very first comment. Otherwise, John Hollins has a question and a comment. John?
Thank you. Thank you, Geoff. You referred to the residence of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. I think it's a little more serious than you presented. I put in the chat a rather good short paper from MIT. The carbon dioxide doesn't decay from the atmosphere in a simple exponential manner. The duration of what we're putting up today is basically simply adding to the amount that has been put up since James Watt invented the steam engine. And that's a really serious matter for me. We're cooked. Well, perhaps not me, but my grandchildren almost for sure. And so I'm really concerned about that. And I know you share that concern. But I'd like to just touch on a second point as well. And that is, you referred to Canada's emissions in the oil that it exports.
yeah.
The European Union introduced, I think last year, something that it calls the carbon border adjustment measure. And that requires traded commodities, both in and out of the European Union, to declare what the emissions were associated with whatever crosses the border. I mean, there was an economic reason for them doing that, because some products were being some European companies were either building factories in other countries to avoid the controls in the EU. So when we worry about emissions from the oil, which is emitted from Canada, I'm a little less concerned than you probably, because there wouldn't be any exports of that oil if there wasn't a client to buy it.
Yeah.
So in my book, the client for that commodity is the one who's responsible for the CO2 emissions emitted during its production.
Yeah, that's true. But the thing is, exports of fossil fuels are going up in Canada. And that's why they want the new pipeline. So they can, and that way they'll show even, less emissions. And they want to promote Canada as being successful in reducing carbon emissions. And we're simply not. Right? And what we're doing is exporting a lot of our trouble to other countries. So
I see another question from Peter McKinnon, which came in rather late, a comment and question. Peter, are you there?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Bob. Thanks, Jeffrey, for an interesting presentation. I have a question. It goes back a little further than your Noah flood period. I'm just wondering if you've come across this with respect to scriptures. As you're probably aware, the Black Sea, of course, drains into the Mediterranean. But at one point, starting about 9,500 years ago, the Mediterranean actually drained into the Black Sea. And I'm just wondering if you have started a draining into the Black Sea. It lasted for about 2,000 years. I'm just wondering if you have any biblical scriptures that relate to that, especially in regard.
How would that happen? That sounds strange. To reverse.
Well, it had to do with the changing sea level and blockage, I guess, by ice that was a part of the deglaciation. But if you look into it, you'll find that the Black Sea the Mediterranean actually drained into the Black Sea, so it was reverse flow. Because normally, of course, the Black Sea flows into the Mediterranean.
I haven't heard that before. No, that's interesting.
Well, you can check it out.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for that. I guess you don't have a comment other than that. That's good.
See a last comment and question from Ted Manning. And then I guess we're doing very well on time, and we'll let Ray cut in when he feels we're close to the end. But we're there now, but there's room for Ted's question. Go ahead, Ted.
Okay, by the way, I can talk about the Black Sea. I worked there for several years, and it is an issue, and it did actually go very suddenly at one point when the Bosporus Straits essentially broke open. And that may, in fact, be part of the rumors behind the flood. They're not sure, but they think the image of watching half of the Mediterranean flow into the Black Sea would have been rather dramatic, and people might have remembered it. Anyway, back to the other question. It strikes me that when we keep talking about this magic number of the amount of carbon dioxide at the top of the mountain, and I'm just wondering, is our assumption that the carbon dioxide intensity is the same everywhere on the planet at any point in time? It just goes up globally? Or in fact, is the top of Mauna Loa a specific place, and is it different than it might be in Chile or in Antarctica or in my backyard?
Oh, I'm sure it differs quite a bit. And I mean, that's why, what's his name, put his lab on Mauna Loa, where had all that ocean before, where they would get well mixed and everything. And that's why I worry about switching to another one, maybe in Chile or Australia or whatever. We're going to lose some discontinuity there. I don't know.
Yeah, well, we benchmarked an awful lot of data when we lost data sources in other scientific areas because we couldn't go back to the same place because it had been destroyed by something else. So again, the scientific community has been very used to benchmarking data over time where we can compare changes if we lose the one that we wanted to look at all the time.
Yeah, but Trump would like to change all that, wouldn't he?
Oh, he just wants them to come to him and pay for it.
A cardinal rule in collecting data scientifically is you always keep the original data clean. You do not vary that, right? Our government doesn't believe in that.
No, when we changed land use survey standards for places, we essentially created new checkpoints and a more variety. Yes, you did benchmark against the old ones you'd been using for a long time, but you knew that someday somebody's going to buy that one and change it. So it may not be the same at the top of the peak or less likely to change, but certainly when you're benchmarking data otherwise, it is a standby. I mean, that's why we keep dead stuff in Svalbard just in case we might need to go and look at it again.
Yeah, you do have to keep your original data clean.
Yeah. Anyway, very interesting, by the way, Geoff. It's a good approach. We have used various kinds of religion and ethnic stuff in the small communities just to raise the notion that somebody might provide them with some guidance regarding what kind of future they are really interested in.
Yeah, just another few pages in my book, I talk about the future climate.
Right.
Something you just mentioned there, when I was teaching at King's, I sometimes had a problem. I would have almost every year, every course, I would have a Muslim who's there just interested in other religions and that's why they're there. But I also had fundamentalist Christians, and they would, as soon as you started talking about anything that goes back thousands of years, that's all wrong,
No, last Thursday was when the world began.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. And they would argue with you and they wouldn't leave off it, right? That was interesting.
Geoff, this was obviously well worth a look. It was a topic that people might look askance at, as you so rightly pointed out, and I think some of the information that you were sharing is certainly of relevance to CACOR, and we really appreciate you taking the time to put this all together, and we'll watch out for that book. This was pointed out CACOR Live number 299. So it's one of hundreds of webinars that we have done in the relatively short time period since we started doing this around the pandemic time. But of course, CACOR goes back over 50 years. It's one of the most active national associations affiliated with the Club of Rome. And we have all kinds of data going back that 50 years, which you can find on our website, which is listed there on your screen, CanadianCOR.com. We are, of course, a volunteer-managed nonprofit, and you can help support this work by signing on as a member or an associate or making a donation. All of those membership fees and donations are fully tax-deductible in Canada. Thanks for watching. I'm sure you will want to check out some of the other videos on our YouTube channel if that's where you're watching. Thanks.